Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And today I'm really intrigued with our guest, and I kind of have my arms crossed because she is posing this question: can millennials save the world? And, of course, people that aren't millennials may have their arms crossed, too. Like, what do they know that we don't know, those young whippersnappers? She's looked into this so much so, she's even written a book about our peaceful planet, healing ourselves in the world for a sustainable future. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Yasmin Davar to our podcast. Welcome, Yasmin.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. I was interested because when I was talking to David and we were looking for different guests and such, and I had come across your information, you were talking, like a lot of people in the States were talking about what was happening with the school shootings in Parkland, Florida, and you are outside of the United States, and I'm sure that it reached the rest of the world, and I wanted to get your take on this very particular problem that we have here in the States, which is gun violence that's happening in all walks of life. In this case, it was in high school. But from the inside looking out, we always feel like the rest of the world is kind of like the Wild Wild West like we are. And I'm wondering, in your neck of the woods, let's talk about, before we get into that, like, where you're from, what's your background, and then we can dive into millennials putting on the Superman cape.
I love the way you put that. Okay, so I live in Australia, and besides the 6 months that I studied in Paris, I've always lived here. I am an environmental engineer, and I have a master's degree in international studies and peace and conflict resolution. And I've worked in academia, I've worked in business, and I've worked for the Australian government. So I have lots of experience in different realms. And I've certainly seen what's possible.
Absolutely. What we talked about in one of our initial podcasts, we were talking a lot about synchronicity and how there's no accidents. And so you have a very, very broad foundation. And I guess having that foundation with engineering, with conflict resolution, you were able to see and not be as myopic as others that are in one discipline.
Correct. And that was the reason that I chose that path.
Interesting. So how did it actually happen? Were your family engineers and you were like this, you're going to be an engineer like your mom or your dad, and that's what we have for you, and you're going to be that for the rest of your life? How did that happen?
Okay, so it was really actually completely the opposite. So my dad was a dentist, and he had hoped that I would follow in his footsteps. And when I declared that I wanted to become an environmental engineer, his response to me was, but women don't become engineers. To which I said, which century are you living in? Of course women become engineers. And that was the correct response. And in fact, in my course, my environmental engineering course, 50% of the students were women. And I would think that statistics remains true 20 years later. I think it is an aspect of engineering that does attract a lot of female participants as opposed to other engineering disciplines. And so I became very interested in waste management as an engineer, and I started a PhD. I was particularly interested in nuclear issues, and I was looking at nuclear waste. But the more I read about the nuclear industry, I really felt that the energy industry was used as a justification to continue the weapons industry. And really that then becomes an issue at the international level with international relations. And that's why then I embarked on my Master's of International Studies in Peace and Conflict Resolution.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I ended up that way, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's one thing that I'm glad you mentioned, that there were so many women represented in the engineering profession. I have a background in actually working with an architecture and engineering firm, and here in the States, we have what's called a STEM, which is science. There's a huge push for science and math, and
we have that here
too. Yeah, that there too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because there's a lot of liberal arts majors, and can't get work after school and such, but there's still a huge misrepresentation, or a lot of women aren't represented, especially in the STEM disciplines as much. So it seems like you guys are a little ahead of us in that aspect.
I don't know. In the other more traditional engineering disciplines, I think that there still is a gender imbalance, and I think that's why we've got the STEM push here as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to do engineering, any form of engineering, you've got to really love maths, which I did. So, I'm funny enough, even at school, I'd say half of my advanced maths class were women. So you're right. I don't know whether there is a perception, which is what this push for women to go into STEM is about. There's a perception that that's less interesting work, or perhaps not as glamorous, and that certainly isn't true in reality.
Mm-hmm. And so you had made the transition in furthering your studies to do conflict resolution. And from me, I'm probably just, from my background, people will go into conflict resolution for a management type position and kind of growing within the company. Is that pretty much the same professional trajectory that you would have there? Is that what pushed you towards conflict resolution?
Oh, no. So the conflict resolution that I was taught was about international conflicts and resolving international conflicts, political conflicts, war. Yeah, it wasn't about conflict resolution within a business sense. But having said that, it's not actually part of my studies that I've ever had to use. When I came back to Australia, I started working for the Australian government in the settlement of refugees, and I did a lot of work developing the policy for the government around that issue.
Interesting. Okay. All right. And in the spiritual world, we always are told that what you focus on expands. So if I am focused on having an intention to have a great day, I'll see a lot in my world that will reflect that. If I feel the opposite, then maybe the opposite would happen. And so if I have a focus on international conflicts or conflict resolution, it seems like you would see it more than the average person. Like, you have no idea how much conflict is going on in the world or what's happening in our backyard.
That certainly hasn't been my experience, no. I think, and this is my life path, my life path is about healing. It's not about creating conflict or seeing conflict. I would not say that there is any less or more conflict than there has ever been. I think it's the same. It was more about being active in being able to provide solutions to make the world a better place.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you were working with the government in Australia. Are you still have any capacity with them now?
I don't. So I finished up with them a little while ago, and I launched my book, and now I'm talking to you.
Oh, we love that. We've had a number of people, myself included, that we had one trajectory of following a linear path, and then we wanted to take destiny in our own hands. So you're at the right place.
Oh, excellent.
And so but you're using your background and you're using what you've learned to apply to today. And so what helped you with, initial background in engineering and then going into conflict, looking at international conflicts. What gave you the foundation to even say that millennials are going to save the world?
This is based on my observation and my knowledge of working with millennials. Everybody, of course, has the capacity to make a difference and to make changes within their own lives, which will impact on others and impact positively on the environment. Everybody has the capacity to do that. What millennials have that I think is a little different is they have a greater understanding of the environment. I think the environmental movement has been hugely successful in the last 20 years in making sure that environmental studies were included in schools, and you guys got way more of that than people of my generation did. And so therefore your awareness is higher. Our impact, your knowledge of our impact on the environment is higher, and so you, I think, have are less blinkered. You look around at what's happening, you think, hey, actually, that's not good, and I understand why. So that's one thing, that you have that understanding, which I think older generations weren't brought up with that, and a lot of them choose to not focus on that. What they were brought up with was more, hey, we're in it for the money, we're in it for ourselves, we're out here to make a success. And those two things are not incompatible. You can be successful and do things which are good for the environment and good for other people. But that isn't necessarily the focus that some of them have. So I've certainly spoken to older people who have refused to acknowledge that there is a problem, and therefore don't acknowledge that there's a problem, then you're not going to do anything to be part of the solution. That was one of the very first things I learned as an engineer. If you're not part of the solution, then you are part of the problem. And I think the other thing that millennials do really well is that they mobilize themselves and they give rise to issues using social media in a way that older generations have not really mastered social media, but millennials really have. And so we see, I think, the rise of now discussions about, I don't know about you guys, but here in Australia there's a lot of discussion about getting use of single-use plastics. And that really rose out of a social media campaign and then reached the traditional media. And that would never have happened otherwise. There is no way that the traditional media would have even started talking about that. So those are reasons why I think that you have a greater understanding. You want the world to be different, and you're prepared to take some action, whereas I think some people in the older generation are a little more, I've got to look after myself and make sure that I'm set up well financially. No, you've got to do that too, but that's not the be-all and end-all of life.
Let me ask you from what I experienced. So the last decade, when I had the suit and tie on, there was this huge environmental push. As a matter of fact, everyone was getting LEED certified. Do you have those type of certifications in Australia?
They're less prevalent here. You're talking about being certified to be sustainable and ethical business. Is that what you're talking about?
Or more of a sustainable buildings. So with the green roofs and looking at cutting energy costs. And what I saw a decade ago, that there was an interest. First it's wary because it's kind of a new concept. And then, there was an interest. But then when the market tanked, then, it was seen as a luxury. Like, we want to design this new building, but we don't want to have all these extra costs to make it environmentally friendly. The environmentally friendly argument is more of, we're looking at the large or the long-term cost, like you're going to save over time. But if a person is going to lose their job because the project went over budget, they're going to say, you know what, we'll worry about that in 10 years or something. Like, we'll put it on the back burner for the next generation. So I'm just wondering on your end if you're seeing, like, is it a resurgence because the market's really robust here in the States. So it seems like, there's been a resurgence for this environmental push, whereas a couple of years ago, not so much.
Here, it's just so patchy. When I lived in Canberra, the territory government there had rules that you could only build energy efficient buildings. You had no choice. If it was a new build, it had to be energy efficient. And so, of course, all the builders complied. And now that I live in New South Wales, which is a different state, they don't have any of those sorts of regulations here. And so people continue to build unsustainable buildings. So unfortunately, this is an issue, I think, where I always talk about how any change has to be both individual driven and driven from the bottom and driven from the top. So government does play a role in creating good legislation, and that's missing where I live right now. So any sustainable buildings that happen now only happen because there are motivated individuals at the helm of those projects.
Gotcha. So it's kind of there's more of a community feel. Like you feel like I have to do it if everyone else is doing it, but if everyone is not, then it's
and I don't have to do it. Then why? I'm not going to.
But you're seeing that millennials are doing that, and I guess that was the impetus for writing your book. What made you write the book, and why now?
What made me write the book? I felt that I had I could see a solution to our problems. And in fact, a lot of the problems that we experience in the world today have solutions which some people are already implementing. It's just that we don't do enough. There's not enough impetus behind them. And so for me, with my broad background, it was a way of bringing those things together and highlighting the fact that those solutions are available and certainly can be done, and encouraging people to get involved. For millennials in particular, the book is not especially aimed at millennials, but given that the rise in activity in millennials, if you like, in the last few months, particularly in the US, I thought it was timely. And certainly the millennials that I talk to are far more supportive of the messages that I give than some of the other people that I've spoken to.
And so looking from the outside in, I'd like to talk about how we actually found you, because you did highlight what was happening in Parkland, Florida, that unfortunate event. How did it strike you, and what did you see that they used that was successful in conflict resolution?
Sorry, how did it strike me? And
how did it strike you? What was your take on it? Because you were highlighting it as far as getting millennials to, what was the difference between their response as opposed to maybe if it happened a generation ago?
Well, it did happen a generation ago, and certainly people didn't mobilize in the way that they have now. Certainly there's better tools in social media, but I also think that there's far less inertia with the millennials. I think that they understand better how well the world is connected. There's less insularity, and I think that because they see so much now through the internet, they understand what's possible. I don't think they feel hindered or bound in the way that older generations do. And they took to the streets and they said, what it was that needed to be said. And I completely applaud them for that so many people got involved, so many young people got involved and said, this is not okay. This is not okay. And if you do not listen to us, there will be ramifications. I thought that was wonderful.
One thing that was really big, or my takeaway from it as a Generation Xer, was, you've had generations of people marching and having outrage. Yes, you're right. It's been happening. It's been ongoing. But one thing that really struck me from a social media standpoint was the fact that the lead, there's always going to be a leader when something like this happens. And the young man that was the face of the change, of implementing change, he's still in high school. So he had his admissions to different universities around the country, and there was 2 universities he didn't get accepted in. And the media had actually a particular channel, I don't want to highlight them, but a major channel here. And they were kind of like what would be seen today in 2018 as a cyberbullying. They were like, laughing at him that he didn't get in. And so he kind of got everyone up to mobilize again and say, you know what, these are the advertisers that advertise this person's show. and look how they're treating us, and look how they're treating this event. And these major corporations pulled major advertising money from that show. Like, they felt an impact immediately that she had to come out and make an apology, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. So that was huge as far as, like you're saying, getting everyone together in one concerted effort.
Yeah, and very, like, excellent strategic work hit them where it hurts. And the same thing with getting everybody to boycott companies that gave NRA members a discount. You're hitting them where they hurt.
Yeah, and I think that's where other generations will be. That's when you really start going from a backyard regular conversation to really paying attention and listening to what's happening. It is a huge impact on social media. And are you seeing that that's the other question I have about social media, because we have what's called the microwave generation, and it's kind of like, well, what's the issue of the week? And then there's an issue this week, and then we forget about it because there's another issue next week. What are you seeing as far as pun intended, sustainability in keeping with a charge that had many people together, but it may go away because they have another distraction going on?
And look, I think that is an issue even with gun control. This is very topical right now because the students did mobilize and they did protest. But there's not a national election going on right now, is there? So their ability to immediately influence politics, is not there, and they need to keep up with the campaign, same as environmentalists do, over a sustained period, and stay focused on their goals and keep putting the message out, and keep reaching people until their goals are reached. And it's a long haul. You're right that there are. I stand a bit further back, but I don't see that there's topic of the week necessarily. I see that there is a recycling of topics over and over again until issues are resolved. Mm-hmm. So sure, like in a couple of months or whatever, you guys might have another shooting and the issue will come up again. Or you might have another oil spill, even though the last one was several years ago, and then the issue will come up again.
That's a really good point, because as of May 2nd, 2018, I think we've had over 300 public shootings in the United States. And so
that is incredible.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring it up, not only for you, but just for the audience.
That is not a statistic to be proud of.
No, it's not. Exactly. And so I think that's the other part of the question, because you did mention the recycling of topics. There is another argument of desensitization, right? Because if like I said, we weren't bragging about that stat, but you're like, if there were one or two, everyone you can gather everybody and maybe gather momentum. But once it gets to the three and four figures, you're like, well, it's just part of the new normal.
Yeah, but I don't think that makes it okay. Think of how many black African Americans were lynched in the South before it was finally outlawed. I don't think that desensitization is an excuse for continuing practices which harm other people in the environment.
No, absolutely. I wasn't saying, we should just throw up our hands. I'm just more of a topical.
But I think that you're right in that it leads to inertia. But people are like, oh, yeah, whatever. As long as it's not me or my family member getting shot, I don't care. And that leads to inertia, people not being willing to sort of sit back and go, you know what, this is not okay, and actually I don't really want to live like this.
Well, I wanted to bring that up because, part one of your book, you're talking about healing ourselves, but then you also go into collective healing. So what are the steps to healing ourselves so we can grow into collective healing?
They're not mutually exclusive, but I do think that the best thing people can do is to heal the hurts that they have inside themselves that cause them to interact with others in a way that may be harmful, And that is not just picking up a gun and killing someone. That might be causing arguments. That might be abuse. That might be carrying resentment around. And all of those things influence your behaviour with other people, and that ripples out. That negative impact ripples out. And so those are the things. I just think it's so important that on an individual level, which is where most of your power lies, that's where you can actually affect the most change. And then when we talk about collective beliefs, as an individual, you hold individual beliefs about what is right and what is wrong, what you deserve and what you don't deserve, how things are in the world. And those beliefs are formed when you're very small, usually, or during times of trauma. Collective beliefs operate in the same ways, but it is a group of people who will participate in a belief. So, for example, there are a group of people in the US who participate in the belief that carrying guns is a right and being able to kill anybody is a right. And then there are people who don't believe that that is so that you've got two opposing collective beliefs. What I encourage is for people to embrace beliefs which support harmony with each other and with the earth. Does that answer your question?
It does, and so here we're coming, at least in the South, we're coming to the end of the school year, and so with Parkland happening, which was the latest news in the news cycle, there was pushback from not only our president, but I think in governments and state governments in Florida, where there has been a conversation of arming the teachers. And so is that a step in the direction of collective healing where you're just like, hey, well, the students are out there armed, the teachers are going to be armed also? If you can look into your crystal ball with what I just told you, what do you think the new school year is going to have in store?
You just need a teacher to shoot the wrong person, and then that whole thing blows up, right? And it's just completely in the wrong direction. Yeah, but I think that, I think you started the conversation talking about how the outside world views the US and that the rest of the world operates in a wild, wild west way in the way that you do, and that actually is certainly not true here. So we had a mass shooting, I think back in 1993, or I don't know, maybe later than that. No, actually it was later than that. But anyway, and it was at a tourist attraction, and a number of people were killed. And the government, and they were a conservative government, leapt into action and said, we don't think this is right. There was a public outcry. We don't think this is right. We're changing the gun laws. And they did that. And they banned semi-automatic weapons, which was what was used. And they restricted who could own a gun. And they enforced laws about how guns had to be kept. So your guns and ammunition have to be kept separately. They have to be locked up. And they did a gun buyback. And that was hugely successful. They did another gun buyback this year. And once again, very successful. Because as a society, we made the decision that we want to live in peace and we don't want to live with the fear that someone may shoot us if we step outside our homes. So the level of gun violence that you guys have, so you can see our collective belief is different. The level of gun violence that you have in the US, where you say there's been 300 public shootings since the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good example of different collective beliefs.
Was the collective belief, and this is very superficial, but here, or not just here, but Facebook is a social media platform, right? And so they have a multitude of changes that happen every day, actually, but they have some that are major, right, that everyone knows about. And so there's usually a huge backlash, like, oh my goodness, I'm leaving the platform and this and that, and then there's a little noise, and then it kind of settles and everyone kind of gets used to the new platform. When you had that incident in the 90s, and then you guys were talking about banning semi-auto weapons and gun buybacks, was there the initial pushback like the example, or everyone was just like, oh wow, we're all in?
We're all in.
Wow.
Overwhelming support.
Wow. Huh. Interesting. So here in the States, we have, from a pharmaceutical standpoint, there's like different stats where a child may have a behavior issue and they're put on Ritalin or something else. And then throughout their lives, they're, staying with the doctor and they're on some type of prescription their whole life. And some of the feedback that we've gotten from the shootings was, the person may have been off their medication. And so here there's a conversation of both mental health and also the correct dosage or maybe the incorrect dosage, or should there be any dosages at all in dealing with children that may or may not have behavioral issues?
Mental health is a tough one, and it actually affects 1 in 4 people. So that means that most families will have some dealings with mental health, and it may not be those kinds of behavioural problems that are treated with what did you call it? The name of the drug?
Oh, the Ritalin.
Ritalin. Depression is a mental health issue. And it's a tough one. I am a big believer that some mental health issues have an emotional cause, and it is worth going and investigating that and healing that as much as possible. And some, of course, don't. Keeping mentally ill patients who have a severe mental illness on their medication really is an issue, knowing people who have gone through that myself. These are tough conversations. It's not an easy problem to solve. But I guess for a broader issue, I would question, why are there so many children who have behavioural issues? What's going on? Is this a genetic problem? Is this an environmental problem? Are there issues of abuse? What actually is going on that there would be so many that require treatment in that way? I would be probably trying to look at it from that way.
I think that's why I bring it up, because you were talking about social media, and with millennials, obviously, they were the first adapters, and so they've embraced social media to the level that other generations have not. And so when these incidents happen, the first places that authorities look at is their social media profile. And on some, they've been alarming, but again, I was talking a little bit about desensitization, where people are like, they look past it, like, they were just kidding, or we never imagined that person would actually act on it, right? Like, you hear, this is just a platform, we weren't really serious about it. And then, we're picking up the pieces when someone may have been displaying certain types of behaviors. So here we have a danger of identifying and also profiling. Yeah.
I think that the law also has been too slow behind this. I mean, you can be quite severely bullied on social media, and there is no legal recourse for that. But if that were to happen in other ways, particularly in print or something like that, you would be able to take people to court and have them, put in detention or whatever, juvenile detention or in jail or whatever, have to do community service. Because what laws do is they create social norms. These things are okay and these things aren't. And because there aren't sufficient laws around it, the collective belief is, we can do anything we want on this platform. And we can, bully anyone, we can say anything we want, we can be prejudiced against other people, we can express violent thoughts, and all of those are okay, when in actual fact in society they're not. So there's a real, I think, dichotomy there that hasn't adequately been addressed. Because the fact of the matter is, if you see something alarming on social media that doesn't have to do with terrorism, but has to do with someone's mental health, there's nowhere you can go to report that. There is literally nothing you can do.
Yeah, it was. I'm a big fan of this podcast called Freakonomics. It sounds like something you might like it if you don't listen to it already. But they did a series with top CEOs around the U.S. and so Mark Zuckerberg was one of them. And so he had mentioned, Facebook has come. Facebook in particular has come a long way from when they started in 2004, right? And so from a business standpoint, but also as a social steward, we're constantly evolving to the changes, right? Before it was just, this is where friends can connect from college, and now, our grandparents, all walks of life are on it. So, but there's an instance where it seems like people are giving their seniority over to social media, where it seems, in the example you used in the early 90s, this was offline. There wasn't even social media back then.
Exactly.
The community kind of got together and mobilized to, ban the semi-auto weapons and do the gun buybacks and make sure or decrease the likelihood of those type of outbursts happening again.
So sorry, what was your question?
So now I was just saying that when we're talking about social media, there's a lot of benefits to it, but there's also a lot of detriments to it. Also, we're looking for social media to maybe police or have all of the answers, where it can just be used as a tool and maybe kind of fall back on your community of IRL and real life people.
You are right that it's a tool. I think that Mark Zuckerberg is right in saying that we should be doing a little bit more policing what people say. But I think that in the end, you couldn't get away with saying those sorts of things, some of those sorts of things, because I think the way that your media acts in the US is different, but you couldn't get away with saying those sorts of things in Australia, in the newspaper or on TV. You couldn't do it. You'd be sued. So that's why I do think the laws still need to change. We still know it just hasn't come far enough in social media. We know that young people are still being bullied on it. We had an experience here where a woman called Tara Moss, who was a former model, released an autobiography in which she mentioned that she had been raped as a young woman. And the backlash, she was receiving messages saying, "I'll rape you again. And you deserved it," and blah, blah, blah. Terrible, terrible things from people who believe that they're anonymous. And what can she do about it? So I do think, once again, a case of people calling for change and then authorities creating change, creating the regulation around that so that people can't behave that way on those platforms.
Let me ask you this about, I'm sorry, I'm kind of taking over, so sorry about that, David. You want to go ahead and jump in?
Well, I was going to just change lanes for a second, so go ahead and ask your question, Hamza, and then I have a question I'll ask.
Sure, okay. So one thing I want to stay here for 1 second, Yasmin, because I think when you were talking about, regulating social media and having some types of laws in place, it's a moving target. And, we see that here where, Facebook wasn't even, like Mark's mentioned how much it's changed since its inception, and social media has changed. Everyone was on Friendster, and then people were on MySpace. And then, I do community service, so my teenage little is like old people are on Facebook, right? So they don't even want to be on they switch platforms. Yeah.
But that doesn't matter. You can still legislate. You don't name specific platforms in legislation. You are less specific about that. So you could just use social media and then define social media.
Go ahead, David.
So, Yasmin, I know you talk a lot about beliefs and changing your beliefs and a person's power to change. And I'm a big believer that my experiences are, from manifest from my beliefs. But in your experience, what are some of the things, I mean, it's easy to say, change your beliefs, but what are some of the things that people really struggle with when they're trying to make those kind of changes?
I think that people, having done quite a lot of work in that area as well, I've seen a lot of people struggle to acknowledge the things that have happened to them. I've worked with, and this is just my personal life, a lot of people who have suffered abuse and who know that it continues to affect them in their lives but won't look at it fully in the face and allow themselves to heal. And so they dodge. They just, even when they're trying to participate in healing processes, they dodge. And then they're only kind of shooting themselves in the foot. But I think that people become scared of reliving the experience, and that certainly with my healing method, that is not what you do. But you really do need to get to a point of where you can forgive and you can release and you can create new experiences for yourself. That's one thing that people struggle with. I have seen people struggle to acknowledge the damage that their beliefs have done in their lives, and that as a result of that they've done to other people. And so I have seen people refuse to acknowledge that their behaviour has had a negative impact on other people, and that is an important part of healing, is accepting responsibility for your actions based on your beliefs. People don't want to acknowledge that they've done something wrong. They may not necessarily want to acknowledge that they've screwed up. But actually that's a really important part of healing and of growing. I think those are the two big ones. And the other thing is, of course, unless you have a healing process which allows you to uncover unconscious beliefs, you're never going to know that they're there, and they're just going to continue to sabotage you. So I think it's really important to have a process that does allow you to uncover those and to heal those so that you can create a better life for yourself and the people around you.
Well said.
I think that's huge about acknowledging behavior, because I want to address that from two different sides. So the first side is if you're big enough, or not even that you have to be a celebrity, but if you have a team around you and something happens and it's reported in social media, then the general principle is, you know what, let's let it ride out, because in 3 days there'll be something else out on social media, right? And then if it starts mushrooming, then we need to have a concerted response. We see that on one end here, but then the other that was a trigger for me when you said the acknowledged behavior of negative impact, we also have a lot of opinions or what have you, and people making decisions and not having all the facts. So somebody's going to be found guilty of something in the court of popular opinion versus going through the regular legal system. And that we see that at least in entertainment, where accusation may happen. There's a lot of behavior of negative impact, and that person could be their whole career could be damaged, the lives of themselves and their families could be damaged. And it was like, oh, well, no, that was an accident, but the damage is already done. And so when you said that, acknowledging behavior of negative impact, we just see a lot of people like, should we even be on social media, right? I mean, it's a 24-hour news cycle now. And it's like, well, you know what? If there's arguments of unplugging because of this negative impact without vetting all of the information. Is the information even right or wrong? Who knows, right? I mean, that takes time. But I don't think that is limited to social media. We see that a lot here in the traditional media, what we call trial by media, forming public opinion, not necessarily giving the full picture. And not everything goes to court, so you don't always have a decision that way. I mean,
it can be very easy to ruin a good person's career, and it can also be very easy to allow a person who has done something wrong to hide. It's up to, I think, all of us to be vigilant is not the right word, but to be mindful that is going on.
I'm thinking of something that's not as negative, but from a business standpoint, in the 80s, people were used to Coca-Cola, and then they came out with New Coke. And then it was a huge backlash here in the States, and they were like, New Coke, but we like the original, right? And then Coke, over time, was able to have a response, and they came out with Coke Classic or Classic Coke, right? And so they had a stumble, and they were able to rectify that over time. And so now I think what you're saying, but with the trial by media and just a lot of the negative impact that's happening, there needs to be more stories of showing where resolution happened, where they were able to rectify damage that wasn't warranted.
Correct. I think there just needs to be more positive reporting generally. There's so much good that goes on in the world that just doesn't get the same sort of traction. And I think that there's definitely a collective belief that we have to live off drama, that we can't absorb any other sort of information. And then that goes to this trial by media as well. We have to live off the drama of something bad happening. Well, actually, that's not true, but that's a collective belief that is held, and that's one that needs to change. We need to have more positive reporting about people who apologise and take responsibility for their actions, as you say, and about the other positive things that go on in the world, about the people who do really contribute to peace and sustainability, just to show that there is progress being made and to encourage other people to get involved.
Yeah, and that's what we were highlighting in part 2 of your book, where you were talking about healing the world. We were looking at creating peace in the post-conflict society, right? So the conflict has already happened, and what's our response? It doesn't have to be a template, or could there be a template? What do you think?
I think we've probably tried a number of templates, but I think that there could be a template. But I think the problem is that there's so many. At the moment, it's just all not very well coordinated. And that's one issue. And the other issue is that the people who are normally involved, who have been fighting, aren't always necessarily committed to peace. And it really is about changing their collective beliefs so that peace can be created in the countries. Get to the bottom of those issues and resolve those issues to the best of your ability, but it does require a change in beliefs before, I think, true resolution happens, and really strong positive leadership. But what we do see, and I think statistically it's proven that in a lot of cases the conflict resolution and the peace building doesn't occur in a way that supports long-term peace, and they revert to fighting pretty quickly. So we've still got a really long way to go with that, and I do think part of the reason is that because those beliefs haven't changed, the situation doesn't change. So that's where we start. We always start with our beliefs because our actions are based on our beliefs.
I want to switch gears a little bit, because in that same section of Healing the World, you were talking about feeding everyone sustainability. What's your if you could let our audience know your take on feeding everyone sustainably, what does that mean?
It means a number of things. There's the environmental, but there's also the social aspect of that. So environmentally, we're talking about reducing our consumption of fertilizers because of the damage and pesticides because of the damage that they do to the environment, and farming using more traditional and sustainable methods, less reliance, because there are some genetically modified crops have allowed people to produce food in a way that they wouldn't have been able to before. So I'm not completely against GMO, but the inability to use seeds from those crops so that you can reseed your own fields or whatever, that, isn't really okay. So there are in the way that farming happens now around the world, I think, needs to change to be able to support people and also to be able to continue to, so that we can eat without completely destroying our environment for generations and generations to come. The other issue is human. So it is about, yes, farmers should be able to not have to buy new seed, but be able to reseed their own crops. But we actually throw out an enormous amount of food, up to 50%. Some of that happens at the consumer end. So I think an average household will throw out 30% of the food that they buy, which is like a real waste of money. But it is also about the fact that sometimes that food doesn't get to market because it is spoiled. There isn't adequate distribution in the countries where it's produced, or that it is rejected based on its appearance. And so it just seems ridiculous. Why are we throwing out all this food when there are so many people in the world that still go hungry? This just doesn't seem right. I really feel that we can get the distribution of food to work a little bit better. And there are things that we can do with that. Sustainable agriculture is, all the things that you can do to farm sustainably, they have been known for millennia. It's not like new. There are lots of different ways you can do it too. So you adapt it to the local environment. And I talk about that in the book. And I think that there are ways that we can also change the way that we consume our food, and distribute it better so that more people can eat.
It made me think of two things as far as backlash of this isn't the way we always done it. And the first one is the mayor, a couple of years ago, the mayor in New York City, he realized that we'll just use the state of New York, they had a huge sedentary lifestyle, and so people weren't as healthy as they should have been. And so he started banning like extra large consumptions of Cokes and things like that. And he did it in a way that was heavy-handed, and there was a huge backlash. And our last president, his wife wanted to introduce proper eating habits and what have you, and changing the food pyramid from the old food pyramid. And again, there was this huge backlash. So if we could leverage millennials and social media, if you can give us maybe one or two examples that would point us in the right direction of empowerment so we can do our own part.
In terms of that particular issue of not being sedentary and eating healthy lifestyles and not wasting food.
Because if you're wasting food, is there an awareness that we're wasting food? I mean, we're just used to it because that happens.
Exactly. And you don't see the impact of it either unless it's highlighted. And social media is fantastic in that. Think of all the images that circulated about plastic floating in the ocean. There's no reason that you couldn't do the same. As an engineer, I've gone to a landfill. I'm going to tell you, they're not the nicest places. And so much of that waste is actually food waste, which is compostable and you could use in different ways. So social media could definitely be used to show people what to do with their food scraps so that they don't end up in landfill. And it could be used to encourage local councils to collect food scraps as well and turn them into compost that can be used in sustainable agriculture. There's so much you can do. I think there can be more promotion of a healthy lifestyle. I think there's a lot of talk about it, particularly in magazines and things, but given that obesity is such an issue, and people aren't necessarily following it, and it needs really good role models as well. It needs people to step up, young people of all ages, to step up and go, this is really easy. We only buy what we eat. We eat healthy. We exercise like this, and we contribute to the environment this way, and we're really happy about it and whatever. It just requires some positive examples and to show people that it's easy to make change. That's the other thing. I understand that those regulation changes haven't worked because no one likes to feel as though their choice is taken away, and I think that was, it's my individual choice to eat that much. And And so I do understand why they didn't work. But it does also require restaurateurs to say, you know what, we're not going to offer those portion sizes anymore. We realise that we are part of the problem, and we're going to promote more healthy eating. It always requires change, like from an individual level, and then from different layers of society. So governments can have healthy eating programs. Businesses can get involved, like I just described with the restaurants, and just say, hey, actually we're going to change our menu and we're not going to provide these huge portions. And then, at the individual level, it is about people going, oh, well, yeah, actually we can change our actions to embrace that. And the other thing is also that for a lot of people, overeating is actually an emotional issue, and it's about then once again dealing with that emotional issue. It's about healing the hurt that you carry inside that causes you to eat too much, and letting it go, and then taking action based on new beliefs, then taking action which supports a healthy lifestyle.
What's your take on incentivizing individuals? I know there are some private companies here in the States, they've been highlighted, where the employees wear Fitbits or some type of tracking mechanism, and those that follow it to a T or what have you, they get extra time off, and as they've seen over the year, that person was healthier, and their insurance went down also. So, but it was on a private level, so it wasn't on a mass scale. I mean, the way you were talking, it seems like it could happen on a mass scale.
It could, but you have to start the conversation. And the conversation has to start from a really real place. Like, I think that it does have to be. I think telling people that they're doing the bad thing, the wrong thing by overeating, taking a negative approach to something never works. It just is a disincentive. What you want to do is encourage people to follow a positive example and to encourage them that they can do that. And part of that is an honest national conversation about why we overeat and what are the emotional things that we're hiding and dealing with those. And then also talking about the positive, healthy lifestyle. And you can do that on all media platforms.
So looking at the crystal ball in maybe a year from now, and you've highlighted the millennials and what they've done successfully, and pros and cons of what we've covered over the last hour, where do you see the next year or the next couple of years going, and leveraging these people that are obviously doing some really positive things, and how it could actually grow?
Where could it go? I really hope that the conversation continues. I mean, you're right in that there are news cycles. They've done some big things to create news, and I hope that that continues so that the conversation is not dropped. And I hope also that they are steadfast in their resolution to make change and follow through with actions like influencing voters whenever there are elections on. Those are all really important things. It really is about sustaining momentum, and sometimes it's hard when you're at the battlefront to constantly feel as though you're supported. So it is about other people showing them that support the whole way through. It's not something that will happen overnight. As we've seen, there's a reluctance within your Congress to change the laws. So this is something that might take a little bit longer, but nevertheless, just so much positive momentum started. It's just a matter of keeping going. And I certainly hope, there certainly seems to be enough passion and energy behind it for that to happen. And I certainly hope it continues.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other questions there, David?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask, this is kind of like a more of a personal question from my end. I'm always curious because we kind of tend to live in a bubble here in the United States. I guess every country has their own bubbles, but growing up and living in Australia, is there anything when looking at the United States that Australians just kind of are in disbelief about or laugh about, or just like, oh, I can't believe they can do this or that, or this is a rule or that's a law? Is anything like that?
Yeah. Honestly, yeah. And look, I've been to the States a number of times. I've been to the States 6 times. I think the thing for us is your reliance on weapons to, as a collective belief, to, what's the right word, reinforce your position in the world and your position, the reliance on weapons you feel gives you strength. Whereas in the book I talk about how strength doesn't come from those are external things. Real strength comes from having inner peace inside, being peaceful inside, and then you don't need those external things. Your reliance on weapons really is just like the use of power, which is often based on very negative beliefs, and you don't need it. So that's something that we all, we all notice, because Australia is what is called a middle power, and we tend to use our diplomatic power internationally, whereas you guys don't as much. You tend to rely more on your weapons and on your guns, and that's not, that doesn't lead to a peaceful world in the long run.
Yeah.
They should be the last resort, not the first resort. The other thing that really gets me, having gone over there and watched some of your TV shows, is how biased your media is, one way or the other. How partisan your coverage of issues is. And I sat down with, I have family over there, so I sat down with my family over there and we were watching, I don't know whether I should say who it was, and it was about an issue with which I have quite a lot of knowledge. And I said to my family, who were like right into it, you realise they've only given you half the facts. And here are the rest of the facts. Like, you by no means are able to form good judgments about issues because it's not presented to you in that way. And that's really, we don't have that as bad over here, like nowhere near as bad over here as you do. And that goes for, I think, both sides of the political spectrum. It's not just one. There needs to be like way more balanced reporting over there, because otherwise then you just have this really prejudiced view about who you are and your place in the world and what's right, and it breeds an intolerance of listening and understanding other people's opinions. That is not very palatable.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, I'm always curious to get eyes that are outside of the United States, because when you're here and you're born and raised, you just, like I said, you get in your own little bubble and you just think this is how things are, and there's so thank you for that.
That's okay. That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
I think there are some collective beliefs at play there, because there are people there who obviously think that that's completely okay. It's okay to only present half the argument that supports your particular point of view, and it's okay for you to personally demonize somebody else who holds a different point of view, and those things don't contribute to harmony within a society, and that leads to violence. Yeah. Angry words are just as important as angry actions. And if you want to create greater harmony, then both of those things need to change, as well as, of course, your beliefs.
Yeah. I think that's one of the criticisms of social media, because, before you're a public company, you have more control over that. But if when you're a private company, you have more control over it. But when you're a public company and you have shareholders, you want to make sure that you're driving revenue. And so if I'm on social media, or if I own a social media platform, I need to make sure that the users are staying on my platform and not going to a competitor. And so that has been the argument of artificial intelligence and algorithms, that I want to give you maybe that half-truth if I'm going to keep you on my platform.
Yeah, that doesn't contribute to any sort of happiness, does it? That's just greed.
It's just funny because you could talk to a neighbor, and you may say, well, on my feed, I didn't see anything that you saw on your feed, right? And so you're like, I thought we all saw the same thing.
No.
And you're not. You're not a victim, but you have an algorithm that's showing you what your cognitive dissonance is displaying.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, as I said, that's an area where legislation hasn't caught up, because it is heavily manipulated as to what you see based on the algorithm. And is that right?
Right. And that's why I asked you the future question, because the rest of the world, all of the world leaders are going to call Yasmin because she has the right image of what the future should behold, and we're all going to pay attention to that.
Thank you.
So if they want to know more about that and they want to pick up your book, if you can tell us your website and social media so people can reach out to you.
Okay, so my website is my name, which is yasmindavar.com. That's YasminDavar.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I have a YouTube channel. I'm sure I'm on Instagram. I'm not on Twitter because that is a platform where there is a lot of hate speech, and I just do not support that, so I refuse to use it. And you can pick up my book online. It is available through multiple online outlets, book retailers.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, you have just experienced another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I'm David.
And Yasmin, it was a pleasure. Let's definitely stay in touch.
Okay, wonderful. I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. See you.
Listen to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective on Radio Public. It's a free, easy-to-use app that helps listeners like you find and support shows like ours. When you listen to our show on Radio Public, we receive direct financial support every time you hear an episode. Experience our show in Radio Public today by listening to the show link in our episode notes, and thank you for listening. Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for a future podcast that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.